In quiet Millbrook, an 85-year-old woman was about to take on the fight of her life. What started as a community meeting took a shocking turn when she came face to face with corruption. Catelyn Lvestsky wasn't your typical retiree. For 50 years, she fought discrimination cases, known for her razor-sharp legal mind. When she encountered developer David Thornton's presentation about closing the community center, she had no idea she was walking into criminal conspiracy. Lvestsky asked questions that would lead to federal investigations, exposing multi-state scheme targeting elderly owners. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The moving truck pulled away from 47 Maple Street with a rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of Catelyn Lvestsky's new life. At 85, she had thought her days of fresh starts were long behind her. Yet here she stood on the front steps of a modest two-bedroom apartment, surrounded by boxes that contained the carefully curated remnants of 6 decades in Chicago. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's tree-lined streets, and for a moment, Catelyn allowed herself to simply breathe in the unfamiliar quiet. "You sure you don't want me to stay night, Mom?" Elena's voice carried the particular blend of concern and guilt that had become their conversational soundtrack since Harold's funeral 8 months ago. "I could sleep on the couch, help you get settled properly." Catelyn tuned to study her daughter's worried face, so much like Harold's around the eyes, but with the determined set to her jaw that Elena had inherited from her mother's side of the family. "Elena Rodriguez," she said with gentle firmness, "you have a husband and 2 teenagers who need their dinner. I've been taking care of myself for longer than you've been alive. I think I can manage one night with takeout and cable television." But even as she spoke, Catelyn recognized the complex dance they were performing. Elena wanted to be helpful without being controlling. Catelyn wanted to be independent without seeming ungrateful. The delicate balance between a mother's autonomy and a daughter's love had shifted since Harold's death, and they were both still learning the new steps. After Elena reluctantly departed with promises to check in the next morning, Catelyn stood in her living room surrounded by boxes and felt the weight of transition settle around her like dust. The apartment was nice enough. Clean, affordable, with good natural light, and a small balcony overlooking a pocket park. But it wasn't home. Not yet. She unpacked methodically, starting with the essentials: her coffee maker, a few changes of clothes, her toiletries, and the framed law degree from Northwestern University Law School, class of 1973. The diploma had followed her through 3 different law offices, 2 house moves, and countless moments of doubt over the decades. Now it would hang in a bedroom instead of an office, a relic of a career that felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The next morning, Catelyn began her exploration of Millbrook with the systematic approach she'd once applied to case research. She walked the 6 blocks of Main Street, noting the mix of long-established businesses and newer establishments that spoke to the town's gradual evolution. Murphy's Hardware still had the original 1940 signage, while the coffee shop next door bore the sleek, minimalist design of modern gentrification. The juxtaposition was telling, a community caught between preserving its history and embracing change. At Millbrook Market, she observed the subtle social geography of small-town life. The young mother with designer athleisure wear barely glanced up from her organic produce selections, while the elderly man counting exact change for his groceries received patient smiles from the cashier that didn't quite reach her eyes. When her turn came, the cashier's tone was pleasant but perfunctory, the voice reserved for senior citizens presumed to be slow with both their money and their conversation. "You must be new in town," the cashier observed, not unkindly. "I'm Maria. Let me know if you need help finding anything special. We carry all the basics." The assumption that her needs would be basic, predictable, struck her as both amusing and slightly irritating, but she simply smiled and thanked Maria, tucking the interaction away in her mental file of first impressions. Her afternoon walk took her to the Millbrook Community Center, a sturdy brick building that had clearly seen better decades, but still radiated warmth and purpose. Children's artwork covered the windows, and a hand-lettered sign advertised everything from senior yoga to after-school tutoring. Catelyn found herself drawn inside by the sound of laughter and the smell of fresh coffee. "Can I help you?" A woman with silver hair and kind eyes approached from behind a cluttered desk. Her name tag read, Dorothy Washington, volunteer coordinator. "I'm just looking around," Catelyn replied. "I moved to the neighborhood yesterday." Dorothy's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "How wonderful! We love meeting new neighbors. I'm Dorothy, and I've been volunteering here for more years than I care to count. Are you interested in any of our programs?" Something in Dorothy's manner, the way she waited for Catelyn's answer without making assumptions about what an elderly woman might want, made Catelyn linger. They talked for 20 minutes about the center's history, the various programs, and Dorothy's background as a retired teacher. By the time she left, she had agreed to attend a community book club meeting the following week. That evening, dinner at Elena's house provided a window into the generational dynamics that seemed to define so much of Millbrook. Elena's husband, Carlos, was warm and welcoming, but their teenage children, Sophia and Miguel, treated Catelyn with the polite disinterest typically reserved for elderly relatives whose relevance to their lives remained unclear. "Abuela's apartment is nice," 16-year-old Sophia offered dutifully when prompted by her mother. "The neighborhood's pretty quiet, 14-year-old Miguel added. "Good for, older people." Elena shot her children warning looks, but Catelyn simply chuckled. "Older people need quiet neighborhoods for their afternoon naps and early bedtimes," she said with dry humor that sailed completely over the teenagers' heads. Later, as Elena walked her to the car, the underlying tensions surfaced more directly. "I hope you'll find things to keep you busy here," Elena said carefully. "The book club sounds nice. Maybe some volunteer work at the library or the hospital?" The suggestion was well-intentioned, but loaded with assumptions about appropriate activities for someone Catelyn's age. "I'm sure I will find plenty to occupy my time," Catelyn replied diplomatically. "It's just that I worry about you getting bored, or—" Elena paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase her concern. "Promise me you won't take on anything too stressful. You've earned the right to relax and enjoy yourself." The subtext was clear. Don't get involved in anything complicated or controversial. Don't make waves. Act your age. Catelyn felt a familiar flash of irritation, tempered by understanding. Elena's protectiveness came from love, but it also came from an assumption that advancing age meant diminishing capability. Back in her apartment that night, Catelyn sat on her small balcony with a cup of tea and the Millbrook Gazette. The local newspaper was thin, but informative, full of planning commission notices, school board updates, and small-town politics. Her legal training had taught her to read between the lines of official announcements, and several items caught her attention. A notice about expedited zoning reviews for downtown development projects seemed oddly rushed. A brief mention of infrastructure improvements that would require temporary displacement of several local businesses lacked important details about timelines and compensation. Most interesting was a small item about the community center facing regulatory compliance reviews that could affect its operating status. Catelyn set down the newspaper and gazed out at the quiet street. She had moved to Millbrook seeking peace after decades of fighting other people's battles in courtrooms across Chicago. She wanted to read books, tend a small garden, spend time with her grandchildren, and let someone else worry about injustice for a change. But as she sat in the gathering dusk, watching lights come on in windows up and down Maple Street, Catelyn recognized a familiar stirring in her chest. It was the same instinct that had driven her through law school as one of only 3 women in her class, the same sense that had guided her through 50 years of representing clients who had nowhere else to turn. Tomorrow, she would unpack more boxes and continue settling into her new life. She would be a good neighbor, a loving mother and grandmother, a quiet addition to Millbrook's community of senior residents. But tonight, reading those carefully worded notices in the local paper and remembering Dorothy's passionate description of the community center's importance, Catelyn couldn't shake the feeling that her retirement might be about to become far more interesting than anyone, including herself, had planned. The Millbrook Community Center's main hall buzzed with the nervous energy of residents who sensed something important was about to happen. Catelyn settled into a folding chair beside Dorothy,
observing the room with the analytical eye that had served her well through decades of courtroom proceedings. The turnout was impressive for a Thursday evening. Elderly residents who remembered when the center first opened, young mothers with children in the after-school programs, teenagers who used the gym, and a smattering of middle-aged professionals who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," announced Sarah Martinez from behind a makeshift podium. At 32, she commanded attention with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Her navy blazer and carefully styled hair projected professionalism, but Catelyn noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she shuffled her papers. "I know many of you have questions about the future of our community center, and we want to be transparent about the challenges we're facing." Dorothy leaned forward in her chair, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. "She called me this afternoon," she whispered to Catelyn. "Wouldn't tell me anything over the phone. Just said I needed to be here."
"But you're also the one who discovered these problems," Catelyn observed. "Doesn't that create something of a conflict of interest?" A few residents shifted uncomfortably. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Lvestsky, while I appreciate your questions, we really need to focus on practical solutions rather than theoretical concerns." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, but it became increasingly clear that all major decisions had already been made. Thornton presented his revitalization plan with colorful renderings of modern buildings and green spaces that bore no resemblance to the community center's current function. Sarah outlined the timeline for the center's closure, just 2 weeks to allow for orderly transition of programs. Residents asked questions, but their concerns were met with vague reassurances and promises to keep everyone informed as the situation develops. Dorothy didn't speak again until after most of the crowd had filed out. She sat slumped in her chair, staring at the community bulletin board covered with photos from decades of events: children's birthday parties, senior citizen luncheons, graduation celebrations, holiday gatherings. 43 years, she said quietly. "I taught kindergarten in this room for 27 years before I retired. Then I've been running programs here for another 16. Her voice broke. "This isn't just a building, Kate. This is where people come when they need help, when they're lonely, when they want to celebrate. Mrs. Patterson learned to read here at age 72. The Martinez family had their anniversary party here every year until he passed." Tears rolled down Dorothy's cheeks as she continued. "We've hosted food drives during every major storm, election watch parties, grief counseling sessions after 9/11. During the 2008 recession, we turned the back room into an unofficial job placement center. When the Hendersons lost their house, we let them store their belongings here until they found a new place." She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "And now they want to tear it down for what? More condos that regular people can't afford?" Catelyn placed a gentle hand on Dorothy's shoulder, but her mind was racing through everything she'd just witnessed. The presentation had been too smooth, too rehearsed. Thornton's answers had been designed to sound comprehensive while revealing nothing substantive. And Sarah Martinez, despite her apparent good intentions, was clearly in over her head. "Dorothy," Catelyn said carefully, "do you have copies of the original property documents? The deed, the zoning permits, anything from when this place was first established?" Dorothy looked up, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "Some things, yes. Why?" Catelyn helped her friend to her feet, her resolve crystallizing with each passing moment. "Because something tells me Mr. Thornton's legal complications might not be quite as complicated as he's making them seem." As they walked toward the exit, passing the children's artwork still hanging on the walls, Catelyn made a silent promise. She had moved to Millbrook seeking peace, but she had never been able to walk away from a fight when innocent people were being hurt.
Dorothy's tears, the residents' confused faces, the too convenient timing of Thornton's discoveries, it all pointed to something much more deliberate than mere legal oversight. They might think she should act her age, but they were about to discover exactly what 50 years of legal experience looked like when properly motivated. Monday morning found Catelyn dressed in her best navy suit, the one she'd worn to court for the last 5 years of her practice, walking purposefully toward Millbrook Town Hall. The building was a blend of old and new, with the original 1920s facade grafted onto a modern extension that housed the expanded municipal offices. Inside, the familiar smell of government buildings, floor wax, copy machine toner, and the faint mustiness of stored documents triggered muscle memory. The receptionist, a cheerful woman in her 40s, looked up with a practiced smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with someone about the legal issues affecting the community center. I have some questions about the zoning violations that were mentioned at last week's meeting." The woman's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, well, that's being handled by our legal department and the council president. Are you interested in volunteering? We have a wonderful seniors program coordinator who might be able to—" "I'm not looking to volunteer," Catelyn interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm a retired attorney, and I'd like to review the documentation regarding these alleged zoning violations." "Oh," the receptionist blinked, clearly unsure how to respond to this deviation from the expected script. "Well, I'd need to check with— let me see who's available." She picked up her phone and spoke in hushed tones, glancing occasionally at Catelyn with the expression of someone dealing with an unexpected complication. After 5 minutes of phone tag, Catelyn was directed to a small conference room to wait for someone from the legal department. 20 minutes later, a harried-looking man in his 50s appeared, introducing himself as Tom Bradley, the town's legal counsel. "Mrs. Lvestsky, I understand you have some questions about the community center situation. I appreciate your concern, but I want to assure you that we have everything well in hand. These are complex municipal law issues that require specialized expertise." Catelyn leaned forward slightly. "I have 47 years of legal experience, including municipal cases. Could you show me the specific zoning violations that were identified?" Bradley's expression shifted to one of polite condescension. "Mrs. Lvestsky, I'm sure you were very accomplished in your day, but municipal law has changed significantly in recent years. The regulations are quite technical, and honestly, even some of our younger attorneys struggle with the complexities." The phrase, "in your day," hit Catelyn like a small slap. She kept her expression neutral, but her voice carried a slight edge. "Which specific regulations are we discussing? I'd be happy to review the relevant statutes." "That's really not necessary," Bradley said, his tone becoming more patronizing. "We have consultants working on this, people who specialize in exactly these types of issues. The best thing you can do is trust that we're handling it properly." Catelyn left town hall with nothing but frustration and a growing certainty that something was very wrong. Her next stop was the office of Sarah Martinez, located in a converted Victorian house that served as an annex to the main municipal building. Sarah was reviewing documents when her assistant showed Catelyn in, and she looked up with a bright, professional smile that dimmed slightly when she recognized her visitor. "Mrs. Lvestsky, what a pleasant surprise! How are you settling into Millbrook?" "Very well, thank you. I wanted to follow up on some of the questions I raised at the community meeting." She's expression became carefully neutral. "Of course, though I hope you understand that Mr. Thornton's team is really the appropriate resource for the technical details. I'd like to understand why independent legal review hasn't been sought. In my experience, when someone with a financial interest in a property discovers convenient legal problems, that warrants additional scrutiny." Sarah's smile became strained. "Mrs. Lvestsky, I appreciate your concern, I really do, but we're dealing with very current legal standards and procedures. Modern municipal law is quite different from what it was in the past. She leaned forward with the expression of someone trying to be patient with a confused elderly relative. Maybe instead of worrying about these complex legal matters, you could help us with community outreach. We'll need volunteers to help residents understand the transition process. There it was again, the assumption that her age disqualified her from understanding modern law, as if legal principles had fundamentally changed since her retirement 5 years ago. I graduated law school in 1973. I've been practicing municipal law since before you were born. I think I can handle the complexities. Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. Of course, I didn't mean to suggest. It's just that we need to act quickly here, and getting too many people involved in the legal analysis could slow things down unnecessarily. The final stop of the day was Catelyn's Millbrook Legal Aid Clinic, housed in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. The young man behind the reception desk looked up from his computer with the eager expression of someone grateful for any distraction from paperwork. Can I help you? I'd like to speak to whoever is handling the community center legal issues. Oh, that would be Marcus Williams. Let me see if he's available. The receptionist disappeared into a back office, returning moments later with a tall, lean young man wearing khakis and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Marcus Williams had the confident bearing of someone who'd graduated near the top of his law school class and wasn't entirely sure why he was working at a legal aid clinic in a small town instead of a prestigious firm in the city. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and his dismissal of Catelyn's capabilities was delivered with such earnest politeness that it was almost worse than outright rudeness. This young man, probably 15 years out of law school, was essentially patting her on the head and sending her off to stuff on.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. So I should just ignore it when I see something wrong? You should enjoy your golden years without the stress and conflict that comes with fighting legal battles. Elena's voice carried a pleading note. You spent 50 years fighting for other people. Isn't it time to focus on yourself, on your health and happiness? Catelyn looked at her daughter, this woman she'd raised to be independent and strong, who was now asking her to be neither. And what if ignoring it means that good people suffer? What if Dorothy loses the community center that's been her life's work? Elena returned to her vegetables, chopping more forcefully than necessary. Then maybe that's unfortunate, but it's not your responsibility to fix every problem in the world. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Catelyn sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad. She'd filled 2 pages with notes from the day's encounters, documenting each dismissal, each condescending comment, each assumption that her age disqualified her from meaningful participation in her own community's legal affairs. The message was clear from every direction. Act your age. Accept that you're past your prime. Leave the important work to younger, more capable hands. Be content with busy work and volunteer activities designed to keep elderly people occupied without giving them any real influence or authority. But as Catelyn reviewed her notes, she felt the familiar fire of determination building in her chest. She thought about Dorothy's tears, about the decades of community memories housed in that building, about all the people who would lose something precious because everyone assumed an elderly woman couldn't possibly understand modern legal complexities. They wanted her to act her age? Fine. She would act her age, all 85 years of accumulated wisdom, experience, and stubborn refusal to back down from a fight when she knew she was right. Tomorrow, she would begin her real work. If they wouldn't let her help through official channels, she would find another way. After all, she hadn't spent 50 years in courtrooms without learning a thing or two about investigation, evidence gathering, and building a case that couldn't be ignored. Let them underestimate the old lady with her 1973 law degree. That would just make her job easier. The Millbrook County Courthouse had the timeless dignity of a building designed to inspire both respect and slight intimidation. Built of Indiana limestone in 1923, it sat at the center of the town square like a monument to the enduring nature of justice, or at least the enduring nature of bureaucracy. Catelyn climbed the broad steps with the satisfaction of someone returning to familiar territory, even if this particular courthouse was new to her experience. The Public Records Office was located in the basement, accessible through a maze of corridors that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. Catelyn had called ahead and learned that the office was open to the public from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., with a lunch break from noon to 1 p.m. that was, according to the recorded message, strictly observed. She arrived at 9:15 a.m. on Wednesday morning, armed with a notebook, her reading glasses, and the patience that came from decades of legal research. Behind the counter sat a man who looked to be in his late 70s, methodically stamping documents with the deliberate precision of someone who had perfected his system over many years. His nameplate read, Frank Morrison, Senior Clerk. And when he looked up at Catelyn's approach, she saw the sharp intelligence in his eyes that age hadn't dimmed. "Good morning," Frank said, his voice carrying the formal politeness of someone accustomed to dealing with the public. "I'd like to review some property records for the downtown area. Specifically, I'm interested in the Millbrook Community Center and the surrounding properties." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. "The community center? That's been getting a lot of attention lately. Are you with the development company?" "Not exactly. I'm a resident who has some questions about the legal issues that have been raised." Something in her tone must have caught Frank's attention, because he studied her more carefully. "Legal issues? You mean the zoning violations and deed problems that Thornton Development discovered?" "Among other things." Frank was quiet for a moment, and I sensed she was being evaluated. "Are you an attorney by any chance?" "Retired. I practiced for 47 years, mostly in Chicago." "Ah," Frank nodded slowly. "And you have questions about the legal analysis that's been provided." "I have questions about whether any real legal analysis has been done at all." Frank's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something approaching interest. "Follow me," he said, lifting a section of the counter to let her through. "I think we should have this conversation in the back." The records room was a researcher's paradise. A row of filing cabinets, bound volumes, and document boxes stretching from floor to ceiling. Frank led her to a small table near the windows, then disappeared into the stacks, returning with several thick folders and a volume of property records. "I've been the senior clerk here for 45 years, Frank said, settling into a chair across from her. "I've seen every property transaction, every zoning change, every legal maneuver that's happened in this county since 1978. And Mrs. Lvestsky, Catelyn Lvestsky. Mrs. Lvestsky, I can tell you that the community center property has been one of the cleanest, most straightforward holdings in the entire downtown area. No liens, no disputes, no zoning violations, no irregular transfers, until about 6 months ago when suddenly it became the most legally complicated property in Millbrook." His tone was dry, carrying decades of experience with political maneuvering disguised as legal necessity. Catelyn felt her pulse quicken. What changed 6 months ago? Frank opened the first folder. David Thornton started making inquiries. Not official requests, you mind, just casual questions about various properties, their ownership history, zoning classifications, that sort of thing. He pulled out a sheet of paper. Then his lawyers started filing requests for copies of specific documents, always polite, always properly submitted, but very targeted. What kind of documents? Original deeds, survey records, zoning board minutes from the 1960s, building permits, environmental assessments. Frank spread several papers across the table. The interesting thing is, they weren't just looking at the community center. They were pulling records on about a dozen downtown properties, all owned by elderly residents or used for community purposes. Catelyn examined the document request forms, noting the dates and the specific records sought. "This looks like someone mapping out a comprehensive acquisition strategy." "That's exactly what it looks like," Frank agreed. And then about 3 months ago, the town's legal counsel started making similar requests. Same properties, similar documents. Tom Bradley was researching the same properties Thornton was interested in. Frank nodded. Almost like they were coordinating their efforts. Catelyn pulled out her notebook and began taking notes. "Can you show me the actual deed for the community center?" Frank retrieved a bound volume and opened it to a marked page. "Here's the original transfer from 1961. Property was donated to the town by the Henderson family estate with the specific stipulation that it be used for community purposes in perpetuity." Catelyn studied the document carefully. The language was clear and unambiguous. The property was to remain a community center, and if that use was ever abandoned, ownership would revert to the Henderson family heirs. This is ironclad. There's no way to legally change the use of this property without violating the deed restriction. "That's what I thought," Frank said. But somehow, Mr. Thornton's legal team has identified zoning violations that supposedly override the deed restrictions. What violations, specifically? Frank pulled out another folder. According to the documents they filed with the zoning board, the current use exceeds the allowable occupancy limit set in 1963, the kitchen facilities weren't properly permitted for commercial use, and the parking area encroaches on a utility easement. He looked up at Catelyn. The thing is, I helped research all those issues back in 1995 when the center applied for a renovation grant. None of those problems existed then. Catelyn felt the familiar thrill of discovering a crack in the opposing case. So either conditions changed dramatically in the last 28 years, or someone is manufacturing problems that don't actually exist. I'd bet on the latter, Frank said quietly, especially since I happen to know that the zoning board member who certified these violations just bought a new house worth twice his annual salary. They spent the next 3 hours going through property records, cross-referencing ownership transfers with zoning board decisions and building permit applications. What emerged was a pattern that made Catelyn's legal instincts hum with recognition. Over the past 2 years, 6 elderly property owners in the downtown area had sold their buildings to companies connected to Thornton Development. In each case, the properties had been purchased at significantly below market value after the owners received notices of expensive code violations or zoning compliance issues. The violations were always serious enough to require costly remediation, but not serious enough to prevent the properties from being purchased and quickly converted to higher value uses. Look at this one, Frank said, pointing to a property transfer record. Mrs. Chen owned the building that housed the flower shop for 37 years. No problems, no violations, no complaints. Then last year, she gets a notice that her building doesn't meet current seismic safety standards and will require $150,000 in upgrades. And she sold to Thornton instead? For less than half what the property was worth. Within 6 months, he'd converted it to luxury condos, and somehow the seismic issues had disappeared. Catelyn studied the pattern of transfers. This is a systematic scheme to force elderly property owners to sell below market value. The community center is just the biggest prize and the most visible. If he can take down the community center using manufactured legal problems, every other elderly property owner in town will know they don't have a chance. As they worked, Catelyn found herself appreciating Frank's methodical approach and encyclopedic knowledge of the local records. Unlike everyone else she'd encountered, he didn't dismiss her questions or assume she couldn't understand complex issues. Instead, he treated her as a professional colleague, sharing information and insights with the ease of someone who recognized competent legal analysis when he saw it. Frank, Catelyn said finally, how much of this pattern is documented in the official records? Most of it. The property transfers are all public record, the zoning board minutes are available, the permit applications and violation notices are on file. The question is whether anyone with the authority to do something.
Frank, she said, I've spent 50 years fighting for people who didn't have anyone else to fight for them. I'm not about to stop now just because someone thinks I'm too old to be effective. Frank smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from anyone in the building. In that case, Mrs. Lvestsky, let me show you some records that I think you'll find very interesting indeed. As they worked through the afternoon, compiling documents and cross-referencing records, Catelyn felt the familiar satisfaction of building a solid case from scattered pieces of evidence. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she was being treated as the capable professional she remained, despite her age. More importantly, she was beginning to see the shape of David Thornton's scheme and the legal vulnerabilities that could bring it down. The week that followed Catelyn's breakthrough at the courthouse transformed her modest apartment into something resembling a war room. Her dining table disappeared under carefully organized stacks of property records, zoning board minutes, and newspaper clippings. A large map of downtown Millbrook covered one wall, marked with colored pins indicating Thornton's acquisitions, pending violations, and properties still under community or elderly ownership. Frank Morrison had become her secret weapon, providing not just access to records, but also the historical context that turned dry documents into a compelling narrative. He visited her apartment each evening after work, sharing coffee and insights as they built their case methodically, one piece of evidence at a time. "Look at this," Frank said on Friday evening, spreading several documents across the coffee table. "Remember the property where Mrs. Chen had the flower shop? I pulled the actual structural engineering report that supposedly identified the seismic problems." Catelyn examined the report, noting the engineering firm's letterhead and the seemingly professional language, but as she read more carefully, something bothered her. This is odd. They're citing building code requirements that don't actually apply to structures built before 1975. Exactly. And notice the date on the report. Catelyn looked more closely. The report was dated 2 weeks after Mrs. Chen had already signed the sales agreement with Thornton. They issued a report justifying violations that were used to pressure a sale that had already happened? Either the most incompetent engineering firm in the state or a report manufactured after the fact to provide legal cover. Catelyn made a note to investigate the engineering firm's other reports for Thornton Properties. The pattern was becoming clearer. A systematic scheme using fabricated or exaggerated violations to force elderly property owners into below-market sales. Her doorbell rang at 7:30 p.m., and Catelyn looked through the peephole to see Dorothy Washington standing on her doorstep, holding a covered dish and wearing an expression of determined purpose. "Dorothy, what a lovely surprise." "I brought dinner," Dorothy announced, bustling into the apartment with the confidence of someone on a mission. "I thought you might not be taking care of yourself properly." She stopped short when she saw the transformed living space. "My goodness, Kate, this looks like a detective movie." Catelyn introduced Frank and gave Dorothy a quick overview of what they'd discovered. As she spoke, Dorothy's expression shifted from surprise to anger to a sort of fierce satisfaction. "I knew something was wrong," Dorothy said, settling into an armchair and accepting a cup of coffee. "That whole presentation felt rehearsed, like they were reading from a script. And David Thornton's concern for our community was about as genuine as a used car salesman's smile." "We're building a case," Catelyn explained, "but we need more than just documents. We need testimonials from people who've been affected by Thornton's tactics." Dorothy's eyes lit up. "I can help with that. I know every elderly property owner in the downtown area. Most of them come to the community center regularly, and they trust me." She paused, considering. "Mrs. Patterson still owns her building where she runs the alteration shop. She mentioned getting some kind of notice about compliance issues, but she was too embarrassed to talk about it." "Would she talk to you?" "She talked to me. So would the Hendersons and Mr. Kowalski and probably half a dozen others." Dorothy leaned forward. "Kate, what you're doing here, this matters. Not just for the community center, but for everyone who's being pushed out of their own neighborhood." Over the weekend, Dorothy became Catelyn's field researcher, visiting elderly business owners and residents throughout the downtown area. What she discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Mrs. Patterson had indeed received a notice requiring expensive electrical upgrades that would cost more than her building was worth. The Hendersons were facing demands for parking lot repaving and ADA compliance modifications. Mr. Kowalski's small hardware store needed new plumbing, new flooring, and structural reinforcement, all based on inspections that seemed far more rigorous than anything applied to other downtown businesses. "They're all scared," Dorothy reported on Monday morning, sitting at Catelyn's kitchen table while Frank examined the violation notices she'd collected. "They're scared. Scared they'll lose their businesses, scared they can't afford the required changes, scared they'll have to sell to the only buyer who seems interested in their problems." Frank looked up from the documents. "These are all issued by the same building inspector, James Mueller. He's been with the town for less than 2 years." "Right after Thornton started making inquiries about downtown properties," Catelyn observed. "Coincidence?" Frank asked dryly. "I stopped believing in coincidences about 45 years ago." Meanwhile, Catelyn had been monitoring the official response to the community center situation. Marcus Williams from the Legal Aid Clinic had been assigned to represent the center's interests, but his approach seemed designed more to manage the transition than to challenge it. On Tuesday morning, she decided to pay him another visit. "Miss Lvestsky," Marcus looked up from his desk with the expression of someone trying to remember why a name sounded familiar. How nice to see you again. Are you still interested in volunteering with the community outreach efforts? I'm interested in the legal analysis of the community center case. Catelyn settled into the chair across from his desk. Have you had a chance to review the actual violation reports? Oh, yes. Pretty straightforward stuff. The violations are clearly documented, and the compliance costs would be significant. Honestly, the community center board is probably better off accepting Thornton's offer to relocate their programs to his new community space. Catelyn felt her patience wearing thin. Have you verified the validity of these violations? Cross-referenced them with actual building codes and zoning requirements? Miss Lvestsky, I appreciate your interest, but the violations were identified by certified building inspectors and confirmed by the zoning board. These are professional determinations by people with expertise in these areas. And you haven't thought to get an independent assessment? Marcus's expression became slightly defensive. Look, I understand that you're concerned about the community center. We all are. But sometimes the best legal strategy is knowing when to negotiate rather than fight unwinnable battles. Catelyn left the legal aid office with the unsettling realization that Marcus Williams was either incompetent or complicit in the community center's demise. Either way, Dorothy and the other residents couldn't count on him for meaningful representation. That evening, Frank brought disturbing news. I had an interesting conversation with Mueller, the building inspector, he said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into his usual chair. I asked him about the process for appealing violation determinations. And he got very nervous, started talking about how all his inspections follow proper procedures, how he's just doing his job, how he doesn't make policy decisions. Frank's expression was grim. Kate, I've known that man for 2 years. He's never been nervous about anything before. Today, he was sweating bullets. Someone's putting pressure on him. Either pressure or payment or both. Catelyn was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. Frank, if we're right about this, if there's systematic corruption involving the building inspector, the zoning board, possibly the town's legal counsel, then we're not just dealing with an aggressive developer, we're dealing with a criminal conspiracy. Frank nodded slowly, which means we need to be very careful about how we proceed, and probably very careful about who we trust. The next day brought an unexpected development. Dorothy called just after lunch, her voice tight with anxiety. Kate, you need to know something. Marcus Williams came to the community center this morning asking questions about you. What kind of questions? He wanted to know how well you knew me, whether you'd been asking about legal documents, whether you seemed confused or had any memory problems. He made it sound like he was concerned about your mental health, but it felt more like he was fishing for information. Catelyn felt a chill run down her spine. What did you tell him? I told him you were the sharpest person I'd met in years, and that if he was too young and inexperienced to recognize competent legal analysis when he saw it, that was his problem, not mine. Despite her concern, Catelyn smiled. Dorothy, remind me never to get on your bad side.
There's more. After he left, I called around to some of the other people who've gotten violation notices. 3 of them said they'd been contacted by someone asking similar questions, whether they'd been talking to an elderly woman about their legal problems, whether she seemed to understand what she was talking about, whether they thought she might be taking advantage of their confusion. The pattern was clear. Someone was trying to discredit her investigation by questioning her mental competence, the ultimate dismissal of elderly concerns. That evening, as Frank reviewed the day's developments, he voiced what they were both thinking. Kate, they're starting to pay attention to what we're doing. That's good news. It means we're on to something significant. But it's also dangerous news. How dangerous? Frank was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking about Mrs. Chen and the Thompsons who sold their building last year and old Mr. Garrett who had that convenient heart attack right after he started making noise about fighting his violation notices. He looked up at her with serious eyes. Kate, what if some of those coincidences weren't coincidental at all? Catelyn felt the weight of Frank's implications settle over her. They weren't just investigating financial fraud, they might be looking at something much more sinister. But as she looked around her apartment, at the carefully organized evidence, at the map showing the pattern of Thornton's acquisitions, at Frank's determined expression, she felt her resolve strengthen rather than weaken. "Frank," she said quietly, "I think it's time we stopped working alone. We need allies, people who can't be dismissed as confused elderly residents." "What do you have in mind?" Catelyn smiled, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, it was the smile of someone ready to go to war. "I think it's time to have another conversation with Sarah Martinez. But this time, I'm bringing evidence she can't ignore." The anonymous envelope appeared under Catelyn's door on Thursday morning, containing photocopies of bank statements and financial records that made her coffee grow cold as she read. Someone, whether out of conscience or fear, had decided to provide evidence that transformed their investigation from municipal corruption into something far more serious. The documents showed wire transfers between Thornton Development and offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, payments to local officials that coincided perfectly with favorable zoning decisions, and most disturbing of all, life insurance policies taken out on elderly property owners just months before they experienced accidents or sudden health crises that led to property sales. Frank arrived for their evening strategy session to find Catelyn pale and shaken, the mysterious documents spread across her kitchen table like pieces of a horrific puzzle. "Kate, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." She handed him the bank statements. "Someone slipped these under my door this morning. No note, no explanation." He examined the documents, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Jesus, Kate, do you understand what these show? Money laundering, bribery, and possibly—" She paused, unable to voice the worst implication. "Murder." Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. "These insurance policies on Mr. Garrett, Mrs. Thompson, the old man who owned the bookstore, they all died or became incapacitated within 6 months of Thornton taking out policies on their lives." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Catelyn's mantel clock. What had begun as an investigation into municipal corruption had revealed something much darker, a systematic scheme that didn't stop at financial fraud. "We need to take this to the FBI," Catelyn said finally. "This is beyond local law enforcement." Frank nodded, then frowned. "But who sent us these documents, and why now?" Before Catelyn could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Martinez's office. "Mrs. Lvestsky?" Sarah's voice was tight with strain. "Can you possibly meet me somewhere private? There are some things about the community center situation that we need to discuss." They agreed to meet at the small park near Catelyn's apartment at 9 p.m. Sarah arrived looking haggard and frightened, her usual polished appearance replaced by the disheveled look of someone under tremendous pressure. "Mrs. Lvestsky, I owe you an apology," she began without preamble. "I dismissed your concerns, and I was wrong. Worse than wrong. I was being manipulated, and I didn't even realize it." Catelyn waited, recognizing the struggle of someone trying to find courage to speak truth. The pressure to fast-track the community center closure, it wasn't coming from legal necessity. It was coming from threats. Someone left photos on my car windshield, pictures of my apartment, my usual jogging route, me having coffee with friends. The message was clear: cooperate or face consequences. "Have you gone to the police?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "The police chief plays golf with Thornton every Tuesday. Half the town council has received development contracts from his companies. Mrs. Lvestsky, I don't know who I can trust anymore." Catelyn studied the young woman's frightened face. "Sarah, did you send me those financial documents?" "What documents?" "Never mind. Tell me what else you know." Thornton's operation is much bigger than just Millbrook. He's been doing this in small towns across 3 states, identifying elderly property owners, manufacturing violations, forcing sales, and eliminating anyone who causes problems. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. Mrs. Lvestsky, I think he's killed people. The confirmation of Catelyn's worst fears hit her like a physical blow. We have evidence, financial records that support everything you're saying. Sarah's eyes widened. Then we have to get this to federal authorities immediately. But carefully. If Thornton realizes we have evidence, we could all be in danger. Over the next hour, they developed a plan. Sarah would use her official position to request an FBI investigation into municipal corruption, providing cover for submitting the anonymous financial documents. Catelyn would continue building the legal case while keeping a low profile. Most importantly, they would move quickly before Thornton realized the extent of what they'd discovered. As they prepared to leave the park, Sarah grabbed Catelyn's arm. Kate, I need you to know how ashamed I am of how I treated you. Your age, your experience, your insights, they were exactly what the situation needed, and I was too arrogant and stupid to see it. Sarah, the important thing now is stopping Thornton before he hurts anyone else. There's something else you should know. Marcus Williams, he's not just incompetent. He's been reporting everything to Thornton. Every conversation with community center board members, every legal strategy discussion, every concern raised by residents. Sarah's expression was grim. If you've been sharing information with him, Thornton knows about it. Catelyn felt a chill run through her. She hadn't shared much with Marcus, but she had mentioned her concerns about the legal analysis. How long have you known? I started suspecting last week, but I confirmed it yesterday when I saw him leaving Thornton's office. Kate, you need to be very careful. If they think you're close to exposing them... That night, Catelyn couldn't sleep. The anonymous documents, Sarah's revelations about Marcus Williams, and the growing evidence of a criminal conspiracy kept her mind racing. She thought about Dorothy, about Frank, about all the elderly residents who had become unwitting targets in Thornton's scheme. Around 2 a.m., she heard a car engine idling outside her apartment building. Looking through her bedroom window, she saw a dark sedan parked across the street with its lights off. The car sat there for 20 minutes before driving away slowly. The next morning brought more disturbing news. Dorothy called in tears. The community center had been vandalized overnight. Windows were broken, equipment damaged, and most significantly, all the historical documents and records stored in Dorothy's office had been destroyed. They took everything, Dorothy sobbed. 40 years of records, photographs, documents about the original property donation, all gone. Catelyn understood immediately. Someone was eliminating evidence and sending a message: stop investigating or face escalating consequences. Frank arrived at her apartment that afternoon, looking pale and shaken. Kate, we have a problem. Mueller, the building inspector, was found dead in his car this morning. Dead? How? Apparent suicide. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. Frank's expression was grim. But Kate, I talked to him just yesterday about those violation reports. He was nervous, scared, but he didn't seem suicidal. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Mueller was the key to proving the manufactured violations, and now he was dead. Kate, we're dealing with people who kill to protect their operation. We need to be extremely careful. I've been thinking the same thing. Frank pulled out a manila envelope. I made copies of everything. All our research, all the property records, all the evidence we've gathered. I'm keeping one set hidden at my house, one set in a safe deposit box, and I want you to keep one set somewhere secure. As they organized the documents, Catelyn realized they had assembled a comprehensive case against Thornton's operation. Property records showing the pattern of forced sales, financial documents proving bribery and money laundering, evidence of
After hanging up, Catelyn called Frank, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried his home number and got a busy signal. Increasingly worried, she dressed quickly and drove to the courthouse.
The public records office was closed, with a handwritten sign reading "Temporarily closed for system updates." Through the window, Catelyn could see boxes being loaded onto carts and computer equipment being disconnected. "Excuse me," she called to a maintenance worker. "When will the records office reopen?" The man shrugged. "Don't know, lady. They just told us to pack everything up and move it to storage." Catelyn felt a growing sense of urgency. Their primary source of evidence was being removed. Their key ally had been neutralized, and Frank was unreachable. She drove to his house, finding his driveway empty and a "for sale" sign freshly planted in his front yard. Her phone rang as she stood staring at Frank's suddenly abandoned home. "Kate?" Frank's voice was strained and tired. "Thank God you answered. Frank, where are you? What's happening?" "I'm at the hospital. They brought me in early this morning after I called 911 about chest pains." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Kate, I wasn't having a heart attack. Someone broke into my house last night and destroyed everything. All our files, all the copies of documents, everything. When I tried to stop them, they roughed me up pretty badly." Catelyn gripped her phone tighter. "Are you all right?" "Physically, I'll recover. But Kate, they got everything. All our evidence, all the documents we'd copied, everything, except what you have at your apartment." "Frank, I'm coming to see you." "No!" His voice was sharp with fear. "Kate, listen to me carefully. They've made it clear that any further cooperation with your investigation will result in much worse consequences for both of us. My grandson received a visit at his college dorm last night. Just a friendly reminder that young people can have accidents, too." The implications hit Catelyn like a physical blow. They weren't just threatening Frank. They were threatening his family. "Kate, you need to drop this. Pack up your evidence and forget everything we discovered. These people are too dangerous, and we're out of allies." After Frank hung up, Catelyn sat in her car outside his empty house, trying to process the speed and efficiency with which Thornton's organization had neutralized their investigation. Sarah suspended and evicted, Frank hospitalized and threatened, the records office closed, and Marcus Williams, their supposed legal advocate, revealed as a spy. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your daughter Elena has such lovely children. Would hate for anything to happen to them on their way to school." Catelyn's hand shook as she read the message. They were threatening her grandchildren, 16-year-old Sophia and 14-year-old Miguel, who had nothing to do with her investigation, but would become collateral damage in Thornton's war against exposure. She drove home in a haze of fury and fear, her legal mind racing through options that seemed to evaporate as quickly as she could formulate them. Without Frank's access to records, without Sarah's official authority, without federal intervention, she had evidence but no way to present it that wouldn't result in harm to the people she loved. Back at her apartment, Catelyn found her front door slightly ajar. Her stomach clenched as she pushed it open to reveal systematic destruction. Her carefully organized files were scattered across the floor, her computer was gone, and her law degree, the 1973 diploma that had followed her through 50 years of practice, lay shattered on the floor, its glass fractured and frame broken. But they had made one crucial mistake in their thoroughness. The manila envelope containing copies of the anonymous financial documents was still tucked inside the cover of her first-year law school textbook, a volume so old and worn that it had apparently seemed worthless to the intruders. She was examining the salvaged documents when Elena arrived, her face pale with worry. "Mom, what happened here? Your neighbor said they saw men leaving your apartment this morning." Catelyn looked at her daughter, this woman she had raised to be strong and independent, who was now caught in the crossfire of a battle Catelyn had chosen to fight. "Elena, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully without interrupting." For the next 30 minutes, Catelyn explained everything: the investigation, the evidence of corruption and murder, the threats, and the systematic destruction of their case. Elena listened with growing horror and anger. "Mom, we have to go to the police. to the FBI, to someone. The local police are compromised. The FBI won't act without an official request from municipal authorities who are now controlled by Thornton's people. And anyone who tries to help us becomes a target. Catelyn showed Elena the text message about her children. Elena, they threatened Sophia and Miguel. Elena read the message, her face cycling through fear, rage, and protective determination. So what do we do? You take the children and Carlos and leave town for a while. Visit your aunt in Denver, make it look like a planned vacation. Don't tell anyone where you're going or when you'll be back. What about you? Catelyn looked around her destroyed apartment, at the broken frame that had once held her law degree, at the scattered papers that represented months of careful investigation. I don't know yet. That evening, Dorothy called with more bad news. Kate, they've accelerated the community center closure. We have to be out by Sunday, this Sunday, not the end of the month like they originally said. On what grounds? Emergency safety concerns. They claim the vandalism revealed structural problems that make the building unsafe for occupancy. Dorothy's voice was flat with defeat. It's over, Kate. They've won. Dorothy! No, Kate. I know you've been trying to help, and I appreciate it more than you'll ever know. But look what's happened. Sarah's been destroyed. Frank's in the hospital. Your apartment was broken into, and now they're threatening your family. Dorothy's voice broke. I won't be responsible for anyone else getting hurt because of this building. After Dorothy hung up, Catelyn sat in her darkened living room, surrounded by the wreckage of her investigation and her illusions about retirement. She thought about Harold, how he would have advised her to be practical, to recognize when she was outmatched, to protect her family above all else. But she also thought about the community center photos Dorothy had shown her. Decades of birthday parties and graduations, literacy classes and grief counseling sessions, a place where people came when they needed help and found it. She thought about the elderly property owners who had been cheated out of their life's work, about the mysterious deaths that might have been murders, about the systematic corruption that would continue unchecked if no one was willing to stand up to it. At midnight, her phone rang. The caller ID was blocked again. Mrs. Lvestsky, the same electronically distorted voice from before. I trust you've had time to consider our conversation. What do you want? Your cooperation. Pack up whatever evidence you think you have, bring it to the community center tomorrow night at 10 p.m., and we'll dispose of it together. Then you'll sign a statement saying you were confused about what you thought you'd discovered, that your investigation was the result of age-related mental decline, and that you apologize for any disruption you caused. The terms were clear. Complete capitulation and public humiliation or escalating threats against her family. And if I refuse? Your grandson Miguel has basketball practice every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. He usually walks home alone afterwards. Such a dangerous world for young people these days. Catelyn stared at her phone with white-knuckled hands. They wanted her to surrender everything. Her evidence, her credibility, her self-respect, and accept the public narrative that she was a confused old woman who imagined the entire conspiracy. But as she looked around her destroyed apartment, at the broken frame that had once held her law degree, at the scattered papers that represented months of careful investigation, Catelyn felt something hardening in her chest. They had underestimated her once by assuming an elderly woman couldn't understand complex legal matters. Now they were underestimating her again by assuming she would sacrifice justice to protect herself. She picked up her phone and called Elena. Mom, is everything wrong? Elena, I need you to do exactly what I told you. Take the children and Carlos and leave town tomorrow morning. Make it look casual, but go. What are you going to do? Catelyn looked at the remaining financial documents that proved money laundering and probable murder, evidence that could still bring down Thornton's operation if presented to the right authorities in the right way. I'm going to remember that I didn't spend 50 years fighting for justice just to surrender when things get difficult. Mom, they threatened the kids.
which is exactly why they need to be safe while I finish this fight. Catelyn's voice carried a steely determination that Elena recognized from childhood, the tone that meant her mother had made a decision that would not be changed by argument or pleading. Be careful, Mom. Elena, I love you. All of you. But I can't let these people win. After hanging up, Catelyn began planning her next move. She had one advantage that Thornton's organization didn't fully understand. 50 years of courtroom experience had taught her that the most dangerous opponent was the one with nothing left to lose. They wanted to meet at the community center tomorrow night. Perfect.
For the first time in days, Catelyn felt a spark of hope. You're willing to risk further retaliation? Kate, they already destroyed my life here. But you know what? I can rebuild a career. Those elderly property owners can't get back their life's work, and those people who died can't get back their lives. Sarah's jaw set with determination. Besides, I didn't go to law school to let criminals threaten my community. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Catelyn opened it to find Marcus Williams standing in the hallway, but not the confident young lawyer she remembered. This Marcus looked nervous, guilty, and somehow younger. Mrs. Lvestsky, could I talk to you? Both of you? Catelyn exchanged glances with Sarah. Come in, Marcus. But I should tell you that we know about your relationship with Thornton. Marcus winced. That's why I'm here. He sat heavily in one of her armchairs, his hands shaking slightly. Mrs. Lvestsky, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to understand that I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Go on. Thornton approached me 6 months ago. He said he was planning major development projects that would benefit the community, but that some residents might resist change due to fear of the unknown. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. He asked me to keep him informed about any legal challenges that might arise, so he could address concerns proactively. Sarah leaned forward. And you believed that? I wanted to believe it. He was offering me a position with his company after my legal aid commitment ended. Good money, career advancement, the chance to work on major projects. Marcus looked up at them with haunted eyes. I told myself I was helping facilitate positive change. When did you realize what was really happening? Catelyn asked. The Millbrook Community Center stood in darkness as Catelyn approached at 9:45 p.m., its familiar brick walls now casting ominous shadows under the flickering streetlights. Sarah and Marcus had positioned themselves across the street with FBI agent Jennifer Walsh, who had driven down from Chicago after Sarah's urgent call. Hidden in unmarked vans nearby, federal agents prepared to document whatever was about to unfold. Catelyn checked her phone one final time, ensuring the recording app was active, then walked toward the building where she had first met Dorothy just weeks ago, the same building where children had celebrated birthdays, where seniors had found community, where Dorothy had poured her heart into serving others for over a decade. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the main hall was lit by a single overhead light, creating a circle of illumination in the otherwise dark space. Dorothy sat in a folding chair at the center of the light, her hands bound behind her back, her face bruised but her eyes defiant. "Kate, don't!" Dorothy started to call out, but a figure stepped from the shadows and placed a hand on her shoulder. David Thornton emerged into the light, impeccably dressed even at this late hour, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile as charming and cold as it had been at the community meeting. Behind him came two other men, one Catelyn recognized as Tom Bradley, the town's legal counsel, the other a stranger with the hard look of someone accustomed to violence. "Mrs. Lvestsky," Thornton said smoothly, "thank you for coming. I trust you brought the materials we discussed." Catelyn held up a manila envelope. "Everything's here. Let Dorothy go." "Oh, I will. After we conclude our business." Thornton gestured to another chair. "Please, sit. We have several matters to discuss." Catelyn remained standing. "The deal was simple. I bring the evidence, you destroy it, I sign your statement, and Dorothy and I walk away." Thornton's smile widened. But circumstances have evolved since our phone conversation. You see, we've learned that you've been quite busy today. Meetings with Sarah Martinez, conversations with young Marcus Williams, phone calls to various federal agencies. Catelyn felt her blood run cold, but kept her expression neutral.
I don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Lvestsky, please don't insult my intelligence. Did you really think we weren't monitoring the communications of everyone involved in your little investigation? Thornton pulled out his phone and played a brief audio clip, Sarah's voice discussing FBI involvement with her Chicago contact. The problem, Thornton continued, is that you've become too dangerous to simply discredit, too persistent, too clever, and unfortunately, too effective at gathering evidence. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his earlier nervousness replaced by cold calculation. Mrs. Lvestsky, you've been suffering from age-related cognitive decline. Tonight, overwhelmed by confusion and despair about your failing mental state, you and Mrs. Washington tragically decided to end your lives together in the building you'd both become obsessed with saving. The plan was sickeningly clear. A murder-suicide that would eliminate both witnesses and provide a narrative explaining away any evidence they might have shared. Very poetic, Catelyn said, but I'm afraid there are a few problems with your script. Such as? Catelyn smiled, the same smile she'd worn in courtrooms when opposing counsel had walked into a trap. Such as the fact that this entire conversation is being recorded and transmitted to FBI agents positioned outside this building. Thornton's composure cracked slightly. You're bluffing. Am I? Catelyn held up her phone, showing the active recording app. Agent Jennifer Walsh of the FBI Financial Crimes Division has been listening to every word you've said since I walked in here. The man with the violent look started to move toward her, but Thornton held up a hand. Calm yourself, Mrs. Lvestsky. Even if you are recording this conversation, you're hardly in a position to make demands. Actually, I am. Catelyn's voice carried the authority of 50 years of courtroom experience. Because while you were focused on monitoring Sarah and Marcus, you failed to notice that I've spent the last week building a comprehensive federal case against your entire operation. She opened the manila envelope and began spreading documents across a nearby table. Financial records showing money laundering through Cayman Islands accounts, insurance policies taken out on elderly property owners who subsequently died under suspicious circumstances, recorded conversations between Marcus Williams and your organization detailing the systematic targeting of community properties. Tom Bradley moved closer to examine the documents, his face growing pale. These are copies. We destroyed the originals. You destroyed Frank Morrison's copies. You didn't destroy the copies I gave to Sarah Martinez, or the copies Marcus Williams made of his recordings, or the copies I sent to Agent Walsh this afternoon. Catelyn's smile widened. Did you really think a woman who spent 50 years practicing law wouldn't understand the importance of redundant evidence preservation? Thornton's charm was evaporating rapidly. You're still just one elderly woman making wild accusations. Actually, she's not alone, Sarah Martinez's voice rang out from the doorway as she entered with Agent Walsh and 3 other federal agents. She's a retired civil rights lawyer with an impeccable reputation, supported by a former town council president, a former legal aid attorney, and the full investigative power of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Walsh stepped forward, her badge clearly visible. Mr. Thornton, you're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. What followed was a blur of activity, federal agents securing the scene, Miranda rights being read, Dorothy being freed from her restraints. But through it all, Catelyn felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with justice finally being served. As Thornton was led away in handcuffs, he turned back to Catelyn with a look of pure hatred. You have no idea what you've unleashed, old woman. This goes much deeper than one small town. Then I guess federal investigators will have plenty to keep them busy, Catelyn replied calmly. The next morning brought a media frenzy unlike anything Millbrook had ever experienced. News vans lined Main Street, reporters interviewed shocked residents, and Catelyn's phone rang constantly with requests for interviews and statements. She was sitting in her apartment, trying to process the whirlwind of the previous evening, when Judge Patricia Holmes called. Catelyn Lvestsky, this is Judge Patricia Holmes. I was wondering if you might have time for a conversation. An hour later, Catelyn sat in Judge Holmes's chambers, a wood-paneled office that radiated the dignity of decades of careful jurisprudence. Judge Holmes, a woman in her late 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes, studied Catelyn with obvious curiosity.
Mrs. Lvestsky, I have to confess something. I've known about your work for years. Your civil rights cases in the 1980s and 1990s were required reading when I was in law school. Catelyn was surprised. I had no idea my work was used in academic settings. Your case against the Chicago Housing Authority in 1987 fundamentally changed how courts view discriminatory housing practices. Your employment discrimination victories in the 1990s established precedents that are still cited today. Judge Holmes leaned forward. So when I started hearing rumors about an elderly woman in Millbrook making wild accusations about municipal corruption, I was skeptical. When I learned that elderly woman was Catelyn Lvestsky, I became very interested indeed. I appreciate the recognition, but I'm not sure why. Because, Mrs. Lvestsky, the Thornton case is just the beginning. His arrest has triggered a federal investigation into similar schemes in 12 other small towns across 3 states. The FBI estimates that hundreds of elderly property owners have been victimized, and at least 6 suspicious deaths are now being reinvestigated as potential homicides. The scope of what they had uncovered was staggering. What had begun as an effort to save a single community had exposed a massive criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. Judge Holmes continued. The federal prosecutors want you to serve as a consulting expert on the elderly targeting aspects of the case. Your experience with civil rights law, combined with your recent investigative work, make you uniquely qualified to help them understand the psychological and legal dimensions of what Thornton was doing. Judge Holmes, I'm 85 years old. I moved to Millbrook to retire, not to launch a new career as a federal consultant. Mrs. Lvestsky, with respect, you've just demonstrated that age is irrelevant when combined with competence, courage, and commitment to justice. The question isn't whether you're old enough to retire, it's whether you're willing to help ensure that other communities don't suffer what Millbrook almost suffered. That afternoon, Catelyn walked through downtown Millbrook, observing the changes that were already becoming visible. The for sale signs that had proliferated around elderly-owned properties were being taken down. Residents who had been quietly preparing to leave were unpacking boxes and reconsidering their options. At Murphy's Hardware, she encountered Mr. Kowalski, the elderly owner who was facing expensive renovation demands. Mrs. Lvestsky, he called out, beaming with relief. That building inspector who was giving me all those violation notices, turns out he was working for Thornton all along. The new inspector says my building is in fine shape, just needs some minor updates that I can actually afford. Similar stories were repeated throughout the downtown area. Mrs. Patterson's alteration shop no longer faced electrical code violations. The Hendersons' parking lot didn't need expensive repaving. The manufactured violations that had terrorized elderly property owners were being systematically overturned. At the community center, Catelyn found Dorothy directing a crew of volunteers who were repairing the damage from the vandalism. The building hummed with activity, not the frantic energy of people trying to salvage belongings before eviction, but the purposeful work of a community reclaiming its heart. Kate, Dorothy called out, her face lighting up with joy. Look at this place. We've had more volunteers in the past 24 hours than we usually see in a month. People who never paid attention to the community center suddenly realize how important it is. Dorothy guided Catelyn through the building, pointing out repairs and improvements that were already underway. The town council voted this.
Catelyn looked around the conference room at lawyers young enough to be her grandchildren, all of whom were treating her insights with the respect accorded to a subject matter expert. It was a far cry from the patronizing dismissals she had faced in Millbrook just weeks earlier. The key, Catelyn explained, is understanding that ageism isn't just about individual prejudice, it's a systematic vulnerability that criminals can exploit. When society assumes that elderly people are confused, mentally declining, or irrelevant to complex issues, it creates the perfect environment for predators like Thornton to operate. Agent Walsh nodded. That's why your role in this prosecution is so important. You're not just helping us understand the legal aspects, you're helping us understand how to prevent this from happening again. The trials, when they came, were a media sensation. Thornton and 15 co-conspirators faced charges ranging from fraud and money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence Catelyn and her allies had gathered proved decisive. Financial records, recorded conversations, testimony from victims across multiple states, and the systematic documentation of a criminal enterprise that had targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Catelyn testified as an expert witness, explaining how ageist assumptions had enabled the scheme to operate undetected for years. Her testimony was covered extensively in legal journals and news media, sparking national conversations about elder abuse, municipal corruption, and the systematic dismissal of elderly voices in community decision-making. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Thornton's defense attorney tried to dismiss her testimony by suggesting that her age made her an unreliable witness. "Your Honor," the attorney said, "Mrs. Lvestsky is 85 years old. Can we really trust the memory and judgment of someone who is clearly past her prime?" Judge Holmes's response was swift and sharp. "Counselor, Mrs. Lvestsky's age is precisely what makes her testimony valuable. She has 85 years of life experience, 50 years of legal practice, and recent first-hand experience with the systematic ageism your client exploited. If you want to challenge her testimony, challenge her facts, not her age." The exchange became a viral moment, replayed on news programs and shared across social media as an example of how ageist assumptions could be confronted and defeated. In the end, Thornton was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The financial settlements for victims totaled over $40 million, and new federal guidelines were established for investigating elder abuse in municipal corruption cases. But for Catelyn, the most meaningful outcome was smaller and more personal. 6 months after Thornton's conviction, she received a letter from Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who had lost her flower shop in the first wave of Thornton's acquisitions. "Dear Mrs. Lvestsky," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that I've reopened my flower shop. The federal settlement gave me enough money to buy back my building and start over. But more than that, your example showed me that being elderly doesn't mean being powerless. Thank you for proving that experience and wisdom are still valuable, even in a world that often forgets to listen to its elders." Similar letters arrived from elderly residents across the 12 towns where Thornton had operated. Each one told the same story: properties restored, lives rebuilt, and dignity recovered through the simple recognition that age brought wisdom rather than irrelevance. As Catelyn read these letters in her Millbrook apartment, now permanently cluttered with legal files and case documents from her consulting work, she reflected on the unexpected direction her retirement had taken. She had come to Millbrook seeking peace, but she had found purpose. She had wanted to escape the demands of legal practice, but she had discovered that justice was not something she could retire from. It was something that would always call to her when innocent people needed protection. The community center thrived under Dorothy's continued leadership, now supported by increased municipal funding and a growing volunteer base that included residents of all ages. The intergenerational programs Catelyn had suggested were breaking down barriers between young and old, creating a more inclusive and respectful community dialogue. Sarah Martinez had been rehired by the county legal department and was being courted by several state political organizations impressed by her courage during the Thornton investigation. Marcus Williams had returned to legal aid work with a new understanding of the importance of listening to all community voices, regardless of age. Most importantly, Frank Morrison had recovered from his injuries and returned to work at the courthouse, where he was now recognized as a local hero whose knowledge and dedication had been crucial to exposing the corruption that had threatened their community. But perhaps the greatest change was in how Millbrook's residents viewed age and experience. The assumption that elderly voices were irrelevant to important community decisions had been replaced by a new recognition that wisdom accumulated through decades of life experience was a valuable resource that should be respected and utilized. As Catelyn prepared for another consulting trip to help prosecutors in Oregon build their case against a similar scheme, she looked at her law degree, now reframed and hanging prominently in her living room. The diploma from 1973 no longer seemed like a relic of the past, but rather a symbol of enduring principles that remained relevant regardless of changing times. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Elena's voice was warm with affection and pride. "Mom, I saw the news about the Oregon case. Are you ready for another adventure?" Catelyn looked around her apartment at the evidence of her unexpected second career. Case files, legal briefs, correspondence from prosecutors across the country, and thank you letters from elderly victims who had found their voices through her example. "Elena," she said, "I think I'm finally understanding what it really means to act my age. It means using all 85 years of experience, wisdom, and determination to fight for what's right, regardless of what anyone else thinks I should be doing." "I love you, Mom." "I love you too. And Elena, thank you for teaching me that protecting my family doesn't always mean avoiding danger. Sometimes it means fighting to make the world safer for the next generation." As she hung up the phone and began packing for Oregon, Catelyn reflected on the journey that had brought her from a quiet retirement to the front lines of a national fight against elder abuse and corruption. She had learned that age was not a limitation, but a source of strength, that experience was not irrelevant, but invaluable, and that the fight for justice was not something you retired from, but something that evolved as your wisdom grew. Tomorrow, she would board a plane to help another community reclaim its voice and dignity. Tonight, she would sit on her balcony and watch the lights come on in the windows of Millbrook, knowing that she had helped preserve not just a community center, but the fundamental principle that every voice, regardless of age, deserved to be heard and respected. The story that began with dismissive words about acting her age had become a testament to the power of refusing to be limited by others' expectations. Catelyn Lvestsky had indeed acted her age, all 85 years of it, with all the wisdom, experience, and determination that came with a life spent fighting for justice. And she was just getting started. The Millbrook Community Center stood in darkness as Catelyn approached at 9:45 p.m., its familiar brick walls now casting ominous shadows under the flickering streetlights. Sarah and Marcus had positioned themselves across the street with FBI agent Jennifer Walsh, who had driven down from Chicago after Sarah's urgent call. Hidden in unmarked vans nearby, federal agents prepared to document whatever was about to unfold. Catelyn checked her phone one final time, ensuring the recording app was active, then walked toward the building where she had first met Dorothy just weeks earlier. The same building where children had celebrated birthdays, where seniors had found community, where Dorothy had poured her heart into serving others for a decade. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the main hall was lit by a single overhead light, creating a circle of illumination in the otherwise dark space. Dorothy sat in a folding chair at the center of the light, her hands bound behind her, her face bruised, but her eyes defiant. "Kate, don't!" Dorothy started to call out, but a figure stepped from the shadows and placed a hand on her shoulder. David Thornton emerged into the light, impeccably dressed, even at this late hour, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile as charming and cold as it had been at the community meeting. "Mrs. Lvestsky," Thornton said smoothly, "thank you for coming. I trust you brought the materials we discussed." Catelyn held up a manila envelope. "Everything's here. Let Dorothy go." "Oh, I will, after we conclude our business." Thornton gestured to another chair. "Please sit. We have several matters to discuss." Catelyn remained standing. The deal was simple. I bring the evidence, you destroy it, I sign your statement, and Dorothy and I walk away. Thornton smiled.
"Catelyn Lvestsky? This is Judge Patricia Holmes. I was wondering if you might have time for a conversation." An hour later, Catelyn sat in Judge Holmes's chambers,
a wood-paneled office that radiated the dignity of decades of careful jurisprudence. Judge Holmes, a woman in her late 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes, studied Catelyn with obvious curiosity. "Mrs. Lvestsky, I have to confess something. I've known about your work for years. Your civil rights cases in the 1980s and 1990s were required reading when I was in law school." Catelyn was surprised. "I had no idea my work was used in academic settings." "Your case against the Chicago Housing Authority in 1987 fundamentally changed how courts view discriminatory housing practices. Your employment discrimination victories in the 1990s established precedents that are still cited today." Judge Holmes leaned forward. "So when I started hearing rumors about an elderly woman in Millbrook making wild accusations about municipal corruption, I was skeptical. When I learned that elderly woman was Catelyn Lvestsky, I became very interested indeed. I appreciate the recognition, but I'm not sure why. Because, Mrs. Lvestsky, the Thornton case is just the beginning. His arrest has triggered a federal investigation into similar schemes in 12 other small towns across 3 states. The FBI estimates that hundreds of elderly property owners have been victimized, and at least 6 suspicious deaths are now being reinvestigated as potential homicides. The scope of what they had uncovered was staggering. What had begun as an effort to save a single community center had exposed a massive criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. Judge Holmes continued, "The federal prosecutors want you to serve as a consulting expert on the elderly targeting aspects of the case. Your experience with civil rights law, combined with your recent investigative work, makes you uniquely qualified to help them understand the psychological and legal dimensions of what Thornton was doing." "Judge Holmes, I'm 85 years old. I moved to Millbrook to retire, not to launch a new career as a federal consultant." "Mrs. Lvestsky, with respect, you've just demonstrated that age is irrelevant when combined with competence, courage, and commitment to justice. The question isn't whether you're old enough to retire. It's whether you're willing to help ensure that other communities don't suffer what Millbrook almost suffered." That afternoon, Catelyn walked through downtown Millbrook, observing the changes that were already becoming visible. The for sale signs that had proliferated around elderly-owned properties were being taken down. Residents who had been quietly preparing to leave were unpacking boxes and reconsidering their options. At Murphy's Hardware, she encountered Mr. Kowalski, the elderly owner who had been facing expensive renovation demands. "Mrs. Lvestsky," he called out, beaming with relief, "I wanted to thank you. That building inspector who was giving me all those violation notices, turns out he was working for Thornton all along. The new inspector says my building is in fine shape, just needs some minor updates that I can actually afford." Similar stories were repeated throughout the downtown area. Mrs. Patterson's alteration shop no longer faced electrical code violations. The Hendersons' parking lot didn't need expensive repaving. The manufactured violations that had terrorized elderly property owners were being systematically overturned. At the community center, Catelyn found Dorothy directing a crew of volunteers who were repairing the damage from the vandalism. The building hummed with activity. Not the frantic energy of people trying to salvage belongings before eviction, but the purposeful work of a community reclaiming its heart. "Kate!" Dorothy called out, her face lighting up with joy. "Look at this place! We've had more volunteers in the past 24 hours than we usually see in a month. People who never paid attention to the community center suddenly realize how important it is." Dorothy guided Catelyn through the building, pointing out repairs and improvements that were already underway. "The town council voted this morning to not only keep the center open, but to increase our funding. Apparently, when federal agents start arresting people for municipal corruption, local politicians become very eager to demonstrate their commitment to community services." In the main hall, where Thornton had once presented his smooth lies about legal complications, a group of teenagers was painting over graffiti damage while their grandparents organized donated supplies. The scene captured everything Catelyn had been fighting for: intergenerational cooperation, community resilience, and the triumph of collective action over individual greed. "Dorothy, I need to tell you something. The federal prosecutors want me to consult on the broader investigation. It might mean travel, long hours, getting pulled back into legal work." Dorothy studied her friend's face. "And you're torn because you came here to retire." "I came here seeking peace, but I found a community worth fighting for and apparently a skill set that's still needed." "Kate, do you remember what you told me the night after that first community meeting?"
You said you'd never been able to walk away from a fight when innocent people were being hurt. I remember. Well, there are innocent people being hurt in 11 other towns. People just like the residents of Millbrook who are being targeted because of their age, their vulnerability, their lack of resources to fight back. Dorothy placed a gentle hand on Catelyn's arm. I think you know what you need to do. That afternoon, Elena called from Denver, having seen the news coverage. Mom, I can't believe everything that happened. When I saw you on the news walking out of that community center with FBI agents, I've never been more proud or more terrified in my life. Elena, I need to talk to you about something. The federal government wants me to consult on the broader investigation. There was a long pause. Mom, are you asking for my permission or telling me your decision? Catelyn smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. I suppose I'm telling you, but I wanted you to understand why. I understand perfectly. You're my mother, the woman who taught me that standing up for what's right is more important than personal comfort or safety. The woman who spent 50 years fighting for people who had no one else to fight for them. Elena's voice carried pride and affection. How long did you think you could stay retired when there was still injustice in the world? So, you're not worried about me getting involved in dangerous situations? Elena laughed. Mom, you're 85 years old, and you just took down a criminal organization that was terrorizing elderly people across 3 states. If I've learned anything from this experience, it's that I should never underestimate what you're capable of. 2 weeks later, Catelyn sat in a federal courthouse in Chicago reviewing case files with a team of prosecutors who treated her not as an elderly consultant, but as a respected colleague. The scope of Thornton's operation was even larger than they had initially realized. A network of corrupt developers, compromised local officials, and systematic targeting of vulnerable populations that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. Mrs. Lvestsky, said Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Chen, your analysis of the psychological manipulation tactics has been invaluable. The way you've connected the ageist dismissal patterns with the legal intimidation strategies, it's given us a framework for understanding how these schemes succeeded for so long. Agent Walsh nodded. That's why your role in this prosecution is so important. You're not just helping us understand the legal aspects, you're helping us understand how to prevent this from happening again. The trials, when they came, were a media sensation. Thornton and 15 co-conspirators faced charges ranging from fraud and money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence Catelyn and her allies had gathered proved decisive. Financial records, recorded conversations, testimony from victims across multiple states, and the systematic documentation of a criminal enterprise that had targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Catelyn testified as an expert witness, explaining how ageist assumptions had enabled the scheme to operate undetected for years. Her testimony was covered extensively in legal journals and news media, sparking national conversations about elder abuse, municipal corruption, and the systematic dismissal of elderly voices in community decision-making. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Thornton's defense attorney tried to dismiss her testimony by suggesting that her age made her an unreliable witness. Your Honor, Catelyn Lvestsky is 85 years old. Can we really trust the memory and judgment of someone who is clearly past their prime? Judge Holmes's response was swift and sharp. Counselor, Mrs. Lvestsky's age is precisely what makes her testimony valuable. She has 85 years of life experience, 50 years of legal practice, and recent first-hand experience with the systematic ageism that your client exploited. If you want to challenge her testimony, challenge her facts, not her age. The exchange became a viral moment, replayed on news programs and shared across social media as an example of how ageist assumptions could be confronted and defeated. In the end, Thornton was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The financial settlements for victims totaled over $40 million, and new federal guidelines were established for investigating elder abuse in municipal corruption cases. But for Catelyn, the most meaningful outcome was smaller and more personal. 6 months after Thornton's conviction, she received a letter from Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who had lost her flower shop in the first wave of Thornton's acquisitions. Dear Mrs. Lvestsky, I wanted you to know that I've reopened my flower shop. The federal settlement gave me enough money to buy back my building and start over. But more than that, your example showed me that being elderly doesn't mean being powerless. Thank you for proving that experience and wisdom are still valuable, even in a world that often forgets to listen to its elders.
Similar letters arrived from elderly residents across the 12 towns where Thornton had operated. Each one told the same story: properties restored, lives rebuilt, and dignity recovered through the simple recognition that age brought wisdom, not irrelevance. As Catelyn read these letters in her Millbrook apartment, now permanently cluttered with legal files and case documents from her consulting work, she reflected on the unexpected direction her retirement had taken. She had come to Millbrook seeking peace, but she had found purpose. She had wanted to escape the demands of legal practice, but she had discovered that justice was not something she could retire from. It was something that would always call to her when innocent people needed protection. The community center thrived under Dorothy's continued leadership, now supported by increased municipal funding and a growing volunteer base that included residents of all ages. The intergenerational program.
Catelyn looked around her apartment at the evidence of her unexpected second career: case files, legal briefs, correspondence from prosecutors across the country, and thank you letters from elderly victims who had found their voices through her example. "Elena," she said, "I think I'm finally understanding what it really means to act my age. It means using all 85 years of experience, wisdom, and stubbornness to fight for what's right, regardless of what anyone else thinks I should be doing. I love you, Mom. I love you too. And Elena, thank you for teaching me that protecting my family doesn't always mean avoiding danger. Sometimes it means fighting to make the world safer for the next generation." As she hung up the phone and began packing for Oregon, Catelyn reflected on the journey that had brought her from a quiet retirement to the front lines of a national fight against elder abuse and corruption. She had learned that age was not a limitation, but a source of strength, that experience was not irrelevant, but invaluable, and that the fight for justice was not something you retired from, but something that evolved as your wisdom grew. Tomorrow, she would board a plane to help another community reclaim its voice and dignity. Tonight, she would sit on her balcony and watch the lights come on in the windows of Millbrook, knowing that she had helped preserve not just a community center, but the fundamental principle that every voice, regardless of age, deserved to be heard and respected. The story that began with dismissive words about acting her age had become a testament to the power of refusing to be limited by others' expectations. Catelyn Lvestsky had indeed acted her age, all 85 years of it, with all the wisdom, experience, and determination that came with a life spent fighting for justice. And she was just getting started. 1 year after David Thornton's conviction, Catelyn stood before a packed auditorium at Northwestern University Law School, looking out at an audience of law students, professors, and practicing attorneys who had come to hear her speak about elder law and systematic discrimination. The irony was not lost on her. The same institution where she had earned her law degree in 1973 as one of only 3 women in her class was now honoring her as a distinguished alumna and pioneering advocate for elderly rights. "When I graduated from this law school 51 years ago," Catelyn began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium, "I thought my biggest challenge would be proving that a woman could be an effective attorney. I never imagined that my greatest legal battle would come at age 85, when I had to prove that experience and wisdom don't expire with age." The audience was rapt, understanding that they were hearing from someone who had become a national symbol of the fight against ageism and elder abuse. Catelyn's story, the retired lawyer who exposed a multi-state criminal conspiracy, had been featured in legal journals, news magazines, and academic conferences across the country. "The question I am asked most frequently," she continued, "is how I knew to persist when everyone was telling me to act my age and leave complex legal matters to younger professionals. The answer is simple. I had spent 50 years learning that justice doesn't care about your age, your gender, your race, or any other characteristic that society might use to dismiss you. Justice cares about truth, evidence, and the courage to stand up for what's right." After her speech, Catelyn was surrounded by students eager to ask questions and learn from her experience. One young woman, probably around the same age Sarah Martinez had been when they first met, raised her hand. "Mrs. Lvestsky," she said,
Do you have any advice for those of us who are just starting our legal careers? How do we prepare to fight injustice effectively? Catelyn smiled, thinking of all the young lawyers she had encountered over the past year. Prosecutors, legal aid attorneys, FBI agents who had taught her as much as she had taught them. She said, "Never assume that age equals wisdom or youth equals inexperience. Some of the sharpest legal minds I've worked with recently have been lawyers young enough to be my grandchildren. But also never accept that getting older means becoming irrelevant. Your experience, your perspective, your accumulated knowledge, these are assets that grow more valuable with time, not less." The drive back to Millbrook gave Catelyn time to reflect on how dramatically her life had changed since that first community center meeting 13 months ago. What had begun as an investigation into local corruption had evolved into a new career as a federal consultant on elder abuse and cases. She had testified before congressional committees, advised prosecutors in 8 states, and helped develop new legal frameworks for protecting vulnerable elderly populations. But perhaps more importantly, she had helped change the conversation about aging in America. The phrase, "acting your age," had taken on new meaning in the wake of her story. Instead of a command to accept limitations, it had become a call to use all of one's accumulated experience and wisdom to maximum effect. As she pulled into Millbrook, Catelyn was struck by the visible changes that had transformed the town over the past year. The downtown area bustled with activity, as elderly property owners, no longer afraid of manufactured violations and forced sales, had begun investing in improvements and renovations. New businesses had opened, drawn by the stability and community spirit that had replaced the fear and uncertainty of Thornton's reign. The community center, which had nearly been lost to Thornton's scheme, was now the crown jewel of downtown Millbrook. Dorothy Washington had overseen an expansion that included new programs for all age groups, a legal clinic for elderly residents, and most notably, an intergenerational council that brought together community members from teenagers to seniors to address local issues collectively. "Kate!" Dorothy called out as Catelyn entered the building. "Perfect timing. We're just finishing up the monthly council meeting, and there's someone I want you to meet." In the main hall, the same room where Thornton had once presented his fraudulent presentation about legal complications, about 30 residents of varying ages sat in a circle discussing plans for a new downtown revitalization project. But this revitalization was different from Thornton's vision. It was designed to preserve the character of the community while making improvements that benefited all residents. Mrs. Lvestsky, a young woman in her early 20s, approached with a bright smile. "I'm Amy Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter. I just wanted to thank you for helping my grandmother get her flower shop back." Catelyn remembered Mrs. Chen's letter, one of dozens she had received from elderly residents who had reclaimed their properties and their dignity through the federal prosecution of Thornton's network. "Your grandmother's courage in testifying helped convict not just Thornton, but his entire organization," Catelyn replied. "How is she doing?" "She's incredible. The shop is more successful than ever, and she's become this amazing advocate for elderly business owners. She started a network to help seniors navigate legal and bureaucratic challenges." Amy's enthusiasm was infectious. "Mrs. Lvestsky, you changed her life. You showed her that being elderly doesn't mean being powerless." Similar conversations had become routine for Catelyn over the past year. Everywhere she went in Millbrook, residents stopped to thank her, to update her on their progress, to ask for advice, or simply to acknowledge what she had accomplished. The elderly woman who had once been dismissed as irrelevant to important community matters was now sought out as a valued voice on everything from municipal policy to family disputes. At Elena's house that evening, Catelyn found herself surrounded by 3 generations of her family, all eager to hear about her latest consulting work and speaking engagement. Carlos had prepared a celebration dinner, complete with a cake that read, "Happy birthday to our hero," in honor of Catelyn's 86th birthday the following week. "Abuela," 16-year-old Sophia said, using the Spanish term for grandmother that had become more frequent as their relationship had deepened. "My government teacher wants you to speak to our class about civil rights and legal advocacy."
My basketball coach heard about you on the radio. He said you're proof that being tough isn't about being young, it's about not giving up when things get difficult. Elena watched the interaction between her mother and her children with obvious satisfaction. Mom, I have to tell you something. When this whole thing started, I was terrified that you were taking on too much stress, that you were endangering yourself by getting involved in something dangerous. And now? Now, I realize that you were doing exactly what you were meant to do. Not just solving this particular case, but showing all of us, including me, that age brings strength, not weakness. Mom, watching you over this past year has taught me things about courage and perseverance that I never understood before. The next morning brought a call from Agent Walsh in Chicago with news about the latest developments in the ongoing federal investigation. Mrs. Lvestsky, I wanted you to be the first to know. We've just arrested the last member of Thornton's organization, the accountant who was hiding assets in offshore accounts. With his cooperation, we'll be able to recover an additional $12 million for victims. That's wonderful news, Jennifer. What's the total recovery now? Over $68 million returned to elderly victims across 14 states. But the monetary recovery is just part of the story. The legal precedents we've established, the awareness we've raised about elder abuse, the changes in municipal oversight procedures, the impact goes far beyond this one case. After hanging up the phone, Catelyn reflected on the scope of what had been accomplished. What had begun as an effort to save one...
Mrs. Chen had reopened her business, displayed a small sign in the window. Thank you, Mrs. Lvestsky, for helping us reclaim our community. Similar signs appeared in windows throughout the downtown area, small acknowledgments of the role she had played in preserving their neighborhood and their dignity. At Murphy's Hardware, Mr. Kowalski was training a young employee while serving customers who ranged from teenagers buying school supplies to seniors selecting garden tools. The intergenerational mixing that had become characteristic of the new Millbrook was visible everywhere, young and old working together, learning from each other, and recognizing that age brought different perspectives rather than diminished value. Mrs. Lvestsky, called out a voice from across the street. Marcus Williams approached with the confident stride of someone who had found his professional purpose. His work during the Thornton investigation had earned him recognition and respect throughout the legal community. But more importantly, it had taught him the value of listening to all voices in the community, regardless of age. Marcus, how are things at the legal aid clinic? Busier than ever, but in the best possible way. We're getting referrals from elderly residents across 3 counties who heard about our work on the Thornton case. But Kate, that's not why I wanted to talk to you. Marcus's expression grew serious. I've been offered a position with the State Attorney General's office, heading up their new Elder Justice Division. The position was created specifically because of the work you did on the Thornton case. Catelyn felt a surge of satisfaction. The case that had begun with her being dismissed as too old to understand modern legal complexities had resulted in a young attorney being given the opportunity to lead a statewide initiative against elder abuse. Marcus, that's wonderful. You've earned this opportunity. I've earned it because you taught me to look past age and assumptions to see the real issues at stake. Kate, I want you to know that every case I handle in this new position will be informed by what I learned watching you work. As evening approached, Catelyn found herself at the community center, where Dorothy was hosting the monthly Wisdom Circle, an intergenerational discussion group that brought community members of all ages together to share perspectives and learn from each other. The program had become one of the center's most popular offerings, with waiting lists for participation. Kate, Dorothy said, would you mind sharing some thoughts about your experience this week? The students are particularly interested in your speaking engagement at Northwestern. Catelyn looked around the circle at faces ranging from teenagers to seniors in their 90s. All were attentive, engaged, and clearly eager to learn from her experience.
It was a far cry from the patronizing dismissals she had faced just over a year ago. "The most important thing I learned this week," Catelyn began, "is that the phrase acting your age should never be used to limit what someone can accomplish. Acting your age should mean using all the experience, wisdom, and knowledge you have accumulated over the years to make the world a better place." A teenage girl raised her hand. "Mrs. Lvestsky, do you think young people can learn from older people's experiences, even if the world has changed a lot since they were young?" "Absolutely," Catelyn replied. "But it's equally important for older people to learn from younger people's perspectives and energy. The most effective solutions come from combining the wisdom of experience with the innovation of youth." An elderly man in his 80s spoke up. "Mrs. Lvestsky, what advice would you give to someone my age who feels like society doesn't value their contributions anymore?" Catelyn thought about the question carefully. It was one she heard frequently in her consulting work, and it reflected a broader societal problem that went beyond individual cases of discrimination. First, recognize that your experience and knowledge are valuable regardless of what anyone else says. Second, find ways to share that experience that connect with contemporary issues and concerns. And third, don't wait for others to ask for your contributions. Offer them actively and persistently until people start paying attention. The discussion continued for another hour, touching on topics ranging from career planning to family relationships to community involvement. What struck Catelyn most was the mutual respect and genuine interest that participants showed in each other's perspectives, regardless of age differences. Later that evening, as Catelyn prepared for bed, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory her retirement had taken. She had moved to Millbrook seeking peace and quiet, expecting to spend her remaining years reading books, tending a small garden, and enjoying occasional visits with her family. Instead, she had found a new career as a federal consultant, a new role as an advocate for elder rights, and a new understanding of what it meant to age successfully in America. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Elena's voice was warm with affection. "Mom, I just wanted to call and tell you how proud I am of everything you've accomplished. Not just the legal victories or the recognition, but the way you've changed how people think about aging and wisdom." "Elena, I need you to know something. Everything I've done this past year has been informed by the values you and Carlos have instilled in Sophia and Miguel. Respect for others, commitment to justice, and the courage to stand up for what is right, regardless of the cost." "Mom, you're the one who taught us those values in the first place." "Maybe, but watching your family, seeing how you've raised your children to value wisdom and experience, regardless of age, gave me the confidence to believe that my voice still mattered, even at 86. After hanging up, Catelyn walked out onto her balcony and looked out over Millbrook. The downtown area glowed with the warm light of businesses and restaurants that were thriving in the new environment of stability and community cooperation. The community center, lit up for evening programs, stood as a testament to what could be accomplished when people refused to accept injustice. But perhaps most importantly, she could see the intergenerational connections that had become the hallmark of the new Millbrook. Teenagers and seniors working together on community projects, young families seeking advice from elderly neighbors, and elderly residents actively contributing their wisdom and experience to community decisions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, another consulting case, another speaking engagement, another opportunity to advocate for the principle that wisdom and experience should be valued rather than dismissed. But tonight, Catelyn was content to sit quietly and appreciate what had been accomplished. She had moved to Millbrook to act her age in the way society expected, quietly, passively, without making demands or causing trouble. Instead, she had learned to act her age in the truest sense, using all 86 years of accumulated wisdom, experience, and determination to fight for justice and dignity for all members of her community. The law degree hanging in her living room no longer seemed like a relic of the past, but rather a symbol of enduring principles that remained relevant regardless of changing times. Justice didn't have an expiration date, and neither did the obligation to fight for what is right. As she prepared to turn out the lights, Catelyn smiled at the irony of her situation. She had tried to retire from the law, but the law, and the cause of justice, had never retired from her. And at 86, she was just beginning to understand the true power that came with acting her age. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it'll take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.